On September 23, 2015, the quiet suburb of Bristol was jolted awake by the horrific screams of Mark van Dongen. A nearby resident peeked out of her window and saw Mark wearing only his underwear, shouting for help, his entire body covered in what looked like mud. She thought it was just a prank, but Mark was in agony. He'd been attacked with acid, and what looked like mud was actually his skin melting away. "What's happening, Cheese?" Somebody threw acid. He threw acid over his face. Apparently had acid thrown over his face. Yeah. Okay. Bear me a second. After the emergency call, Mark quickly received medical attention and was rushed to a nearby hospital. During the ride, he kept repeating that it was his ex-girlfriend who had done this despicable act on him, and her name was Berlin Wallace. In today's episode, we're diving into the case of Mark van Dongen, one that began with a love story but ended in the most gruesome way possible. Before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. Mark van Dongen was born in the Netherlands. In 2011, he moved to the UK to study engineering at the University of Bristol. He was smart and driven, and after graduating, he landed a well-paying job as an engineer. But life hadn't always been smooth. Before moving to the UK, Mark had contracted HIV from a brief relationship. He took the diagnosis seriously and chose to date only through websites for people who were also HIV positive. That's where he met Berlin Wallace, a South African-born aspiring fashion designer. Despite being nearly 20 years older, Berlin and Mark began a relationship soon after he arrived in the UK. What started as a connection built on shared vulnerability would eventually spiral into something dark and deadly. Mark's father was the first to something was off about Berlin. He doubted her intentions and felt her love for Mark wasn't genuine. Still, despite his concerns, Mark's father tried to build a bond with Berlin. He had no idea his gut feeling about Berlin was spot on, and that the truth was even worse than he imagined. Behind closed doors, Mark and Berlin's relationship was toxic from the start. It began with constant verbal abuse. Berlin would often lash out, yelling at Mark over the smallest inconvenience. It didn't take long for the abuse to turn physical. Things escalated from simple slaps to a terrifying moment when she poured a kettle of boiling water over him. Friends and co-workers began to notice the signs. Mark once showed up to lunch covered in scratches after Berlin had flown into a jealous rage. He brushed it off with excuses, always trying to downplay what was really happening behind closed doors. Still, despite the growing concern from those around him, Mark's feelings for Berlin didn't change. He never reported her to the police. Instead, their relationship grew more serious. They eventually moved in together and spent nearly 5 years living under the same roof. While they were together, Berlin didn't just torment him mentally and physically. She drained him financially. She was unemployed, refused to attend school, and relied entirely on Mark, who worked full-time as a civil engineer and earned a solid income. She used his money to support her lavish lifestyle and even sent money back to her family in South Africa. Being with Berlin felt like being trapped in a prison. Every time Mark tried to end the relationship, she'd threatened to hurt herself. And when that didn't work, she'd threatened to report Mark to the police for abuse. Accusations that were completely false. At one point, she even stole his passport to stop him from leaving the country. Over time, her efforts to control him only became more desperate. She repeatedly claimed to be pregnant, only to later say she'd miscarried, always before showing any real signs. This cycle played out again and again. Mark endured this nightmare for 5 long years. The breaking point for him only came when Berlin's abusing tactics shifted. She stopped threatening to end her own life and began threatening to take his instead. That's when Mark knew he'd had enough. In 2015, Mark went back online and met a woman named Violet. Their first date went so well that they decided to meet again. Spending time with Violet in public made Mark realize how healthy and genuine a real relationship could be. He eventually ended things with Berina and moved forward with his new girlfriend. However, he was far from living a peaceful and happy life as Barina wouldn't let him go easily. Their breakup took a toll on her and she constantly harassed both him and Violet, even attempting to blackmail them. Mark had to call the police to report Berlin's behavior. Although the police warned her that violating the Protection from Harassment Act could lead to legal charges, Berlin didn't care. She kept making silent phone calls to Violet and even threatened to end her life to Mark. Mark sensed things were spiraling out of control and feared what Berlin might do next. However, what he couldn't predict was just how far she would go to, completely destroy his life. On the fateful night, Berlin called Mark in distress, telling him she was giving up and moving back to South Africa. She claimed she had nothing left and that she might just end it all then and there. Berlin insisted on seeing Mark one last time, and despite everything that had happened, Mark agreed to meet. He arrived at her home in the upscale Westbury Park area of Bristol. While he didn't want her to hurt herself, he made it clear that their relationship was over and that he was moving on with Violet, his new girlfriend. As a gesture of goodwill, possibly driven by guilt, Mark even agreed to help her financially. He promised to continue paying her rent and offered her $750 a month to live on. But with just that, Barina wasn't satisfied. As the hours passed and Barina's fraying nerves showed no sign of calming down, Mark decided to stay the night at her flat. He eventually went to bed, unaware that Barina was just pretending to sleep. Once she was certain Mark had fallen asleep, Berlin quietly slipped out of the room and stepped outside to make a brief, mysterious call to her ex-boyfriend. Returning to the flat, Berlin went to the kitchen where she filled a glass with acid. At 2:00 a.m., she suddenly woke Mark with a scream. "If I can't have you, me and Durr must have been unimaginable." Mark managed to stagger outside, screaming for help. Neighbors nearby heard his desperate cries and rushed over, only to be met with a horrifying sight of Mark's body melting away. They immediately called for emergency help and tried to assist Mark as best as they could. In their rush, however, they unknowingly took him closer to Barina's apartment, thinking they were getting him to safety. Mark, realizing where they were headed, grew increasingly frantic. He cried out, "She lives there, she lives there," then begged them to take him somewhere else. When they finally reached a nearby apartment and entered the bathroom, the full extent of his injuries became tragically clear. Mark barely held it together. His face, chest, abdomen, and thighs were covered in chemical burns, and his vision was slowly lost. When the first responder arrived, his eyes had turned gray with his irises practically dissolved. Mark pointed to a tattoo on his stomach that read Berlin, and he said, "She needs to go to prison for this." As they rushed him to the hospital, Mark insisted the officers check on Violet's house, fearing Barina would go after her next. Meanwhile, as chaos unfolded, Barina calmly returned to her home, sat on the sofa, and made one last phone call to her ex-boyfriend. Shortly after the police arrived at her door, they found her sitting there, eerily calm as though nothing had happened. She was arrested without resistance and was soon brought in for interrogation. During the interrogation, when the police asked her what she had thrown at him, she casually replied, "It was acid." She then claimed she had been using it to distress fabric. Then, to explain her brutal attack, Berlin carefully fabricated her own narrative and shifted the blame onto Mark. She accused Mark of being the violent one, claiming they had argued and that he told her to end her life by drinking the acid. In a fit of rage, she threw it back at him, thinking it was just water. She even added that she tried to help him wash the acid off in the bath, but that Mark had run out of the house in fear. "Yeah, he did, because he said to me it was water. I've got water for you. Like you come and take your medication and go to bed. He wanted me to burn my insides. And I appreciate I probably know the answer to this, but I will ask you anyway. Why didn't you call the ambulance? I was just confused and about loads of things. Like I was confused." Despite her attempts to spin her tale, the police weren't buying it. Soon after her interrogation, she was charged with throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm and was held in custody while the investigation continued. In the meantime, Mark was taken to a decontamination room at Southmead Hospital in Bristol. When he caught a glimpse of his distorted reflection in the mirror, he broke down, sobbing and begging to die. He was in no condition to provide more information to the police. It took them 10 days to track down his family in Belgium. When Mark's family was finally contacted, his brother was the first to arrive. He didn't even recognize Mark at first. His face was unrecognizable, scarred beyond repair. The acid had eaten away all the muscle in his arm, and his bone was slowly deteriorating. Before long, Mark fell into a coma. His left eye was completely blind and his right eye had only limited sight. His father, Keith van Dongen, came to visit him later, and just like his brother, he didn't even recognize his own son. Throughout this time, Mark endured unimaginable pain, recurring septic infections, night terrors, and severe PTSD. His brother described how the constant itching of his scars drove Mark to the edge of madness. For months, Mark remained in a coma, receiving intensive care. He was fed through a tube and could only breathe with the help of a ventilator. Eventually, his lower leg had to be amputated. 10 months after the attack, Mark woke up and was able to give the police more details about what happened. It was a slow process. He could only move his mouth. So he communicated by sticking his tongue out when his father moved his finger across an alphabet board. Over time, he regained the ability to speak, but he was paralyzed from the neck down. His condition quickly led him into a deep depression, and Mark became increasingly withdrawn. He was often irritable and angry with the hospital staff, although he occasionally said he wanted to live. Most of the time, he wished he hadn't survived. It became clear that he would need lifelong care, so he was moved to a care facility. His father asked Mark if he wanted help with the move, but Mark insisted on doing it himself to maintain some independence. After this conversation, Keith returned to Belgium to work. The next day, Mark called his father frantic, screaming for him to come back. Keith rushed back to the hospital to find Mark in a complete meltdown, covered in his own excrement. At that point, Keith decided to take Mark back to Belgium with him without informing the police. Once home in Belgium, Mark developed another chest infection and was told he would need a tube inserted into his throat to drain the liquid. This procedure would likely leave him unable to speak, stripping away his last remaining bit of independence. Faced with this, Mark decided to apply for euthanasia. A month later, the doctors who reviewed his case determined that due to the unbearable physical and psychological suffering, Mark met the criteria for euthanasia under Belgian law. Although it was devastating, Keith understood what his son was going through. The acid continued to burn his son's body. Though still alive, he was paralyzed, lying in bed, forced to endure unbearable pain. On January 2, 2017, after 15 months of relentless suffering, Mark chose to end his life. He asked his father to be by his side in his final moments, and Mark passed away at just 29 years old. Verena Wallace's trial began on October 9, 2017 at Bristol Crown Court. During the proceedings, she continued to tell anyone who would listen that Mark was controlling and violent, and she insisted that she thought she was simply throwing a glass of water at him. Earlier in her interrogation, Berlin claimed that she and Mark had argued after he bragged about sleeping with another woman. She said that in response, she told him, "Why don't you just kill me?" According to her, Mark then went to the kitchen, returned with a cup of acid, and urged her to drink it. However, in court, realizing how unbelievable this story was, she changed her account. She now claimed that Mark had given her a glass of water, and after their argument, she threw what she thought was water back at him. She also said that Mark must have been angry because she had threatened to expose his past, claiming he had been a prostitute in the Netherlands as a teenager, an accusation that appeared to have no basis in truth. Her story began to fall apart when the prosecution presented irrefutable digital evidence that proved she had planned the attack. They revealed that in the days leading up to the incident, Verena had searched for 82 articles on acid attacks. This highlighted Barina's obsession with acid attacks across the UK. She spent hours online obsessively reading article after article about these incidents. Eventually, she purchased a 1-liter bottle of acid from Amazon, removed the label, and hid it away. Around this time, she also made a killing remark to a counselor, saying she felt like she could destroy everything around her. By September, Barina's research into acid attacks became more specific. She looked into what would happen if someone drank the acid. She also continued searching for ways to win back an ex-boyfriend, all while secretly plotting something far darker. Berlin even researched potential defenses she could use if the police ever investigated her. It was clear her plan had been carefully calculated, and her obsession with revenge had reached a dangerous level. When confronted with the evidence, she claimed she had been contemplating ending her own life and wanted to know what would happen if she used the acid on herself, especially if she drank it. When asked about the large volume of research, she tried to explain it as simple curiosity. Claiming she hadn't read the articles, only looked at the pictures, she insisted that the timing of her searches was purely coincidental. In a bid to gain sympathy, Berlin began making claims about Mark's behavior throughout their 5-year relationship. She said he was violent and racist, accusing him of forcing her out naked onto the street during a trip, kicking her in the back and punching her in the head. Throughout it all, she denied any wrongdoing. Even as the gruesome details of Mark's injuries were read aloud in court, Berlin remained cold and emotionless. The only time she cried was when it became clear that her lies weren't convincing anyone, that she wasn't going to get away with her attack. After a month-long trial, finally in May 2018, Berlin Wallace was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 12 years after being found guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. However, she was acquitted of murder charges because Mark van Dongen's death was not directly caused by the acid attack, but by euthanasia 15 months later. It was an unexpected and bizarre twist. Barina was not held responsible for his murder. Mark's father was furious with the sentence, feeling it was far too lenient. Speaking about Barina, he added, "I never knew she was like this. It turns out she pulled the wool over our eyes from day one." Mark's brother felt the minimum 12-year sentence wasn't enough and hoped that Barina would mess up in prison and not be eligible for parole. Like many others, he wanted the assurance that she would remain locked away for the rest of her life. As of now, Barina Wallace could be eligible for parole as early as 2027, considering the time she has already served before being sentenced. However, her release would depend on the parole board's determination that she no longer poses a danger to the public. Many people, though, believe she doesn't deserve that chance, and they have good reason to think so. That brings us to the end of today's episode. What are your thoughts on this gruesome case? Do you think Berlin Wallace deserves a more harsh sentence? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories.